And I'm also fortunate to be a board member with American Society of Evidence-Based Policing and National Institute of Justice Lead Scholar. And I only bring those up because obviously, as I speak about my experience in a smaller town in Southern California, I at least have the opportunity to have colleagues throughout the country that we've been talking, and sharing experiences as we go. So I'm really excited to be with you all and learn more about policing in other countries as well, in regard to the pandemic. So just a little bit of context, I'm sure most of you know, but for those of you who don't, in the United States, we have about 18,000 different law enforcement jurisdictions and different police departments. Local police departments like Redlands, where I live and work, it's about 70,000 people in population. We have about 84 sworn police officers. And clearly that varies very much from a city like Los Angeles, a very big city um, with a much larger police force. Then you have the sheriff's departments. They police the counties. They also run our jails. And then state police forces like California Highway Patrol, state troopers in other states, and then, of course, the federal law enforcement. And I only bring this up because while we all work well together and closely, clearly we're going to have different policies, procedures, and response in regard to a variety of different topics, and we may even have different laws depending on state to state, clearly as well. So with all of that in mind, and when asked to sit in on this panel, I was asked to think about the challenges in policing during this pandemic, and really there were 4 points that I want to speak about in terms of the challenges that we faced and then overcame, and some of the opportunities that came out of that. So the first really had to do with our initial response. We learned quickly from others, predominantly Washington State seemed to be hit hardest the first, and then on the East Coast as well. But we started really contemplating the new policies and procedures and how it was that we were going to protect our police force so that we can continue to serve our community, and also how we were going to help to keep the community safe as well. So looking at different policies and procedures, how we were going to do that, we started looking at outdoor roll call before we got into the virtual options that now exist for us, clearly mass distancing, changing our policies and procedures. For example, taking phone reports. We had not been taking phone reports prior to the pandemic, but definitely started pushing for that, and I anticipate we'll probably continue that after the pandemic. Citing people or giving summons to appear in the field, not bringing people into the jail when being arrested, minimizing discretionary arrests or contacts, not responding to medical aid calls. We had previously responded to medical aid calls, but really leaving that to our fire and EMS partners, especially because one of the issues that we ran into was lack of personal protective equipment, whereas our fire and EMS partners seem to be better prepared or better equipped in that manner. We had been very open to the community, so we would have tours of our station, ride-alongs with the community, and so we changed, obviously, all of these things to protect our folks. And it wasn't, again, because I work in a local municipality, I can only speak from what I saw from the outside looking in, but the jails were following suit. They were looking at how they could release people that were not going to be violent to the community. And I'm sure, without having a sheriff's deputy on here to talk about the mitigation of how that worked in the jails, I can't speak to the specifics, but I do know that there was a lot of work to keep folks out of the local jails. Additionally, the courts also fell in line. They would file on our cases, but would file them with zero bail. And really I would say it was March 16th that our chief actually put out a memo with our plan of all the different mitigating factors and policies and procedures that we were going to put in place moving forward. And so some of those were just mentioned. So as I mentioned before, we did face difficulty in getting the personal protective equipment and cleaning materials. There was difficulty in sharing information between the Department of Public Health initially and some of the other community organizations. But definitely as we worked through those issues early on, we became really good at sharing information and using technology to share the information that we could to help our officers have a better response, in the community, understanding where there might be hotspots, um, and what might be, and I say hotspots in regard to COVID, not in terms of crime, which I'll get to at the very end. We actually factored in COVID into, we had a dashboard with our crime. And so, who would have ever thought, right, that we would be factoring in this pandemic into how our crime rates were fluctuating. And I'd be interested to hear, Nikki, in terms of the research that you're doing that Jean mentioned on that. So at any rate, we worked on local data sharing, problem solving efforts, and then larger scale organizations like the Police Executive Research Forum, American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, International Association of Chiefs of Police, all the different organizations were working on efforts to collate and share information on policing methods and responses to the pandemic. PERF came out like on a daily with different emails of what was going on across the country. ASCBP developed a website where we could share this information. And I think that that was really, really helpful, being able to put those things in place in terms of how we were going to respond. So the second point from my perspective really has to do with protests. And I'm kind of taking this in a chronological format because, in May of 2020, I think we all watched in horror the death of George Floyd. And that ignited protests and riots throughout the country, some of which are still continuing on today. I have been in policing now for 22 years, and I can say during that time, I had never experienced protests like what we're experiencing even in our small town. And, this was happening amid stay-home orders, right? And mask orders. And it really created a unique situation in terms of balancing our community's First Amendment right to free speech, but also the safety of the community in light of these stay-home orders and our employees. And I feel very fortunate working in Redlands. We were able to work with most of our protest organizers very well to maintain the peace and the safety of the community. But it was definitely a unique time. Like I say, not only a first in terms of dealing with protests on a large level, having over 1,200 people walking the streets of Redlands in protest of the police, while also thinking about this health and safety issue of the pandemic. There really was a lot of discussion for us around the enforcement of mask laws, the stay-at-home mandates, and I think like many agencies, we really focused on education in terms of gaining compliance with our community. And any enforcement really fell to our code enforcement officers or the Department of Public Health, not so much in the policing. And I truly believe that really was the best route because the question of creating any confrontation that might lead to a use of force was clearly of a lot of concern, on the heels of George Floyd and all the other riots and things that have been going on across the country. And I just think it was a better all around, both for law enforcement as well as for the community. In terms of being, in an attempt to be transparent and legitimate with our communities, it really was important for us to police the community in a way that they wanted to be policed and at their direction. However, I think like many other issues in our country, the public was really polarized. There was public that wanted us to enforce these mask mandates and the stay-at-home mandates. And then there was, the opposite side that completely did not believe that those mandates were legitimate. And so, like I say, I think education really seemed to work the best for us. So, initially the protests were about abolition of the police and defunding of the police, but because of some of these other issues that were going on with the lockdowns and the masks, we started seeing other political protests, protests against the stay-at-home order, protests against the masks, and then later, and I'll talk about it, kind of the fourth point is against the vaccine. We even actually saw protests arise over vaccine sites, which was really interesting to me. So after overcoming the initial challenges, addressing protests in light of the pandemic, we really, I think, saw the third challenge, and that was the fiscal challenge, right? And I'm sure that others can speak to this as well. But by June, we learned that we were going to have a major shortfall, and we ended up seeing layoffs or a loss of 31 positions in the department. And 21 of those were actually layoffs. So, not only is it a challenge, right, to keep your community safe and address the issues in the pandemic, but now we even have less staff to do that. And I know that we weren't alone. And so that was kind of the third point. And then the fourth point really comes into the vaccine, right? Towards the end of 2020, early 2021, we thought, hey, here's the light at the end of the tunnel, the vaccine is coming. And so the conversation at that point, I think because everyone had adjusted to policing in the pandemic and addressing things in a different way and developing new resources and partnerships, then the chatter came down to, okay, the vaccine is coming. So how are we going to get the vaccine? Who's going to get the vaccine? How is it going to be distributed? And even more fascinating was who was going to take it, because there were a myriad of reasons why people would or would not be vaccinated. So we were really fortunate. We have a good working relationship with our local hospital, and they had an excess of vaccine, and they made it available to any of our staff that was willing or that wanted to have it. And then our fire department, the hospital, us, and some other community partners, the university, as well as Esri, all started working together to have points of dispensary for the vaccine in the community and make it available to the community once that was available. And obviously we worked in tandem from a security perspective. Thankfully, we did not have any issues. I mentioned the protests. I think most of those were in Orange County and Los Angeles, larger municipalities. We didn't have any issues like that. Things have seemed to have gone smoothly. In fact, we all worked together to make the vaccine available to some of our more underserved populations in the community. And I really felt like that was a great opportunity, for these partnerships to develop and work through. So those, I think, were some of the biggest challenges that we faced. But I definitely think they led to opportunities, problem solving, solutions, partnerships. Obviously, I haven't even talked about crime. I'm trying to be mindful. I know you mentioned that you want us to stay in that 10 minutes. But like I said earlier, it was fascinating to watch the property crime, just drop, which of course everyone was at home. But then a lot of our commercial crime, we saw more in the commercial crime because of course the businesses were not up and running. And like I say, I'll be interested to see kind of at the end of this when I can focus in on that, what all those different trends are. Clearly in the US, we're seeing an increase in violent crime at this point. But, like I said, who would have ever thought we'd be putting COVID statistics and pandemic factoring that into, our crime stats and crime response. So hopefully that's helpful, Jean, to kind of set the stage from our perspective here in the US.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating. I'm tempted to open this up for discussion, but I think it's better that we move on and we get all the speakers and then see what similarities and differences there are. Just before I bring in Ian, just to say I'm very remiss. I should have asked at the beginning that you're all happy that this session is recorded. Because we thought there were going to be interesting insights from this. So Richard did press the record button. I hope you're all okay about that. if you speak on this, we'll check it with you before making anything public. Also, we know that Stephen and Emma from the UK are still struggling to get in because of Thames Valley Police firewalls. So I'm just going to just ask Phil Davis if he might be prepared to do some impromptu comments if they're not in by the time we need them, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Phil.
You like keeping me on my toes, don't you, Jane?
I do, yeah. But we know it's impromptu, so that would be great. So let's go to a completely different time zone and go to a different experience in many ways, and go to Ian Barnes, who's from New Zealand and who's the harm prevention manager for New Zealand Police.
Ko Fox Hill te monga, e ru ne taku nako, ko Embrook te awa e mahia ne aku maharahara, no Wokinga mahau, ko Sonyu Takawahine, ko Ian Barnes toko ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, e tio, e huka, e hauhu, tihe, Māori ora. So I just introduced myself there using my pepeha, which is a traditional Māori way of introduction, and said a blessing or karakia for the conversation or kōrero that we're about to have. And hopefully the relevance of that will become clear in just a moment. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the roundtable. My name's Ian Barnes. I'm the harm prevention manager for the Wellington region in New Zealand. And it's easy to say perhaps that we in New Zealand are really lucky or fortunate or blessed that we have such a low rate of infection and a low mortality rate. But as this is a conference on public management, I think it would be remiss of me not to say that I think it probably had an awful lot to do with good leadership, strategy and planning, which led to good public management. So from the outset, our government's aim was very, very clear. It was elimination. They also were very clear there is no plan B. And they were prepared to accept the advice of experts and approve the public policy settings that supported the achievement of their objective. And that's probably why I'm talking to you from my office today rather than from my spare bedroom. But so yeah, with the exception of a period from the 25th of March 2020 to 13th of May 2020, the life of Wellingtonians have basically gone on as usual. There were 2 outbreaks outside of that time period, which saw restrictions increased in Auckland, but the rest of the country is largely carried on as it was before. But what can I sort of take away from the experience of COVID and the lockdown that we did have? Well, New Zealand Police was founded out of the Armed Constabulary, which was introduced to put down insurrection. So very much in that militaristic tradition of policing. But with the disestablishment of the Armed Constabulary and the creation of New Zealand Police, that Filian tradition of policing came to the fore. So now back to my introduction. New Zealand's founding document is the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a treaty between the Crown, of which we're servants as police, and iwi, that is the Māori tribes. So the 3 principles of the treaty are partnership, participation, and protection. And these principles sit quite comfortably alongside those that are commonly attributed to Peel. So the notion of policing by consent, the public as the police and the police as the public, the minimal use of force, and the emphasis on the absence of crime and disorder rather than police action in dealing with them. And so the partnership with iwi was seen really strongly throughout our response to COVID-19. 100 years prior, Māori experienced disproportionate infection and mortality from the pandemic that raged then. In fact, they were 7 times more likely to die from Spanish flu as their European counterparts. So unsurprisingly, there was a large amount of anxiety and fear in that community with this when this pandemic broke. And we had some of our isolated communities, think about, like a village at the end of a peninsula, they took matters into their own hands and felt that if they put roadblocks in place to stop people coming into their community or leaving it, then they would be safe. So probably a traditional police response would have been to promptly go and get rid of those, sweep aside those roadblocks and ensure people's kind of free movement of goods and people was able to carry on unhindered. But instead, what we did was we partnered with those communities to make sure that the people at the roadside were properly protected, their families were protected, and they were able to carry those roadblocks out in a way that made sure that they were safe, they felt safe, and people's legitimate right to free movement was also protected. So our approach became summarized by what we called the 4 E's. So, and they're to be read in this order. And this was sort of communicated widely to our staff. So it was engagement, education, encouragement, and only if all of that has failed, enforcement. But that approach is essentially underpinned by the concept of discretion, because in the words of our commissioner, the law applied without judgment can lead to worse outcomes than the harm at which the law is directed in the first place. However, the application of discretion is always subjective and therefore it is always potentially the subject of debate. So my personal view, and this is a personal view, I haven't researched it or anything, but there's possibly a distinction between policing on one hand and law enforcement on the other, because I think law enforcement sort of suggests that there's a style of policing where there's relatively low levels of discretion and is more grounded in, whereas policing is, perhaps more grounded in that tradition of maintaining the consent and, and therefore use of discretion. So in the Wellington region, which is probably what I can speak to most easily, because that's where I work and where I'm based, the importance of being integrated with a network of partners proved really vital, and it was interesting to hear, that's true elsewhere as well. So the government strategy was, go hard, go early. And as a result, we moved to a stringent lockdown really within a few days. We didn't get much notice. And so we were left scrambling, trying to get arrangements in place to deal with some really complex situations. We were aware from overseas, most notably Italy, that family violence was likely to increase and cause people a lot of problems because they would essentially be trapped with their abuser. So my team made contact with all our partner agencies, including Women's Refuge, to understand what their business continuity plans looked like and how they were going to be able to operate or be able to keep operating throughout with lockdown restrictions in place. So in the case of things like the safe houses, they were able to continue operating, but with lower levels of capacity, and surplus capacity had to be provided through motels. We had to clarify as well that the social workers that we depend on were classified as essential workers and could therefore continue to operate. And we had really great support from the Ministry of Social Development, so that people that we issued with a police safety order, that is, one of those orders where if you turn up to a family violence incident and you order somebody away from the home for a set period, in New Zealand it can be up to 10 days. If they're not allowed to go and stay with their extended family or with friends any longer, where do they go? So the ministry managed to, did some rapid work and secured a whole lot of hotel places where we could take those people and for the duration of the order. We also then moved our daily multi-agency triaging of family violence cases or risk assessment of family violence cases onto a video conference platform. But as it turned out, we had an initial spike in terms of family violence, and then it dropped right away. And that caused us quite a lot of nervousness and anxiety because we weren't sure whether that was just people failing to report. And probably a benefit of being only in that state for a relatively short period was we were able to then reach out and contact people after the lockdown restrictions started to be lifted. And one of the things that they said, which was pleasing in some ways and really frustrating in others, was that actually they were okay. And when we asked why, they said, well, all these social agencies have been up the driveway and they've given us food parcels, they've given us blankets, they've given us heat, made sure we've got enough heating. So all of these short-term triggers for this, for family violence were essentially being addressed and taken away by social service agencies stepping up and going the extra mile. That's basically also the source of frustration in that, it happened in a crisis, but why can't it happen on a day-to-day basis? But yeah, iwi were really vital to our success in that regard as well, because they know their people, and their people are much more likely to engage with members of their own iwi than they are with public service agencies. So they were able to get through doors that we would ordinarily struggle to get through. And so yeah, maintaining that partnership is going to be really important in the future as well. Yeah, the Ministry of Social Development also put in place really arrangements so that we could get homeless people housed. So if we came across people that needed housing, then they were obviously much more vulnerable to catching COVID and potentially spreading it. So we were able to get them into emergency housing. That's caused us some issues longer term, but in the short term was really good. And sort of yeah, like Rachel said, we also tried to make sure that we minimised our use of remand and kept, so particularly in like the youth justice space, I think we didn't have a single kid placed on remand throughout that lockdown period, and we rapidly moved to implementing a thing called the Remand Options Investigations Tool, which was being piloted at the time in Auckland, and that just moved straight to nationwide rollout. My alcohol harm team also found themselves pretty busy as the alert levels changed, keeping licensees up to speed with what the requirements were at a given alert level. So we've gone around doing that face to face, making sure that they understand. But also was good to see was that work we'd done over the previous 18 months was paying off. We were trying to rebuild relationships with the hospitality sector, and we had a couple of examples where they ended up policing their own, which was fantastic to see. So last thing for me, which will be about managing the workforce during COVID as well. So we segmented our people into different groups in case the rates of infection meant that our front line started to get a bit stretched with people falling sick. Fortunately, that wasn't needed, but we had people like a second wave ready to backfill them, and then if they all started falling over, a third wave of people ready to come in. So yeah, and the people in the second and third waves were essentially under mandates to work from home and keep themselves safe. Yeah, and as we've come out of the lockdown, we've then had to staff up the managed isolation and quarantine facilities. So what we've done there is we've turned over one of our community policing stations as a dedicated station for that team, and tried to put in place precautions to stop any infection getting out of that station. So all the washing machines, the dryers, everything is in there. So uniform doesn't have to go home to be washed. Everything just stays in the station. And I think staff who've had to do that have been basically told to isolate during the weekends and things like that as well. So just try and stay within their family bubbles, which is a big ask. Fortunately, we've now got the vaccine available, so those staff working at the border have been vaccinated. But yeah, it was a big ask to basically for our people to put themselves in a sort of a more vulnerable position and put their loved ones in that position as well, which kind of brings me almost full circle, because it kind of brings me almost back to that kind of Pelian tradition of constabulary members voluntarily giving service in the interest of community welfare and existence, which is essentially what policing is all about. So that was our experience of New Zealand Police and Wellington region in a nutshell.
Great, kia ora, thank you very much indeed. And really interesting that you start in speaking Maori as an indication of a very different culture and approach, I think, to this. Thank you. Again, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We're pleased to say that Stephen Chase has now managed to get in. So welcome, Stephen. But I think Emma Bailey is still struggling. Let's go to Wouter now in the Netherlands and hear what the experience is there.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I would like to share some first experiences that we have during the first wave, because the study I'm conducting is focusing on the first wave that we had in March till May last year. And the next slide, please. Yeah, something about my background. I have a police background, so from the beginning, I'm very much interested in how police officers do their work. And I took a master in sociology, a PhD thesis, focusing on police patrol work and the use of information technologies, which is one of the main lines in my research, actually. But as I shall point out, I now move to a study on policing the pandemic. Next slide. I had planned a study on police patrol work and the use of information technologies. And the idea was using systematic observations. And then COVID-19 came, and of course, it was not possible to observe police patrol work. And then I proposed to change the subject of the study and focus on what COVID-19 did to the work of police officers, day-to-day police patrol work. And of course, we used corona-proof research methods. We interviewed police officers via online connections. And we did this in 3 police stations across the country. We spoke to 33 police officers until now, and we asked them to tell about their work under COVID circumstances, but also we asked them to, in more detail, talk about 2 cases that they had experience with. So 2 real-life cases, 2 per person, so 66 cases we made a reconstruction of. We also had admittance to police records, so we could also produce some overview with police statistics. And we have planned some expert panels, but they are not yet done. Next slide. These are the cities where the research focuses on. As you all know, the Netherlands is a small country, but we managed to find 3 locations with quite a distance between them. And on the next slide, yes, we are now in the process of analyzing the data. And what we did in this study, we asked police officers what COVID-19 meant for them personally, because, you know, most important part of police patrol work is the police officers who actually do this work. And it's very important to realize that COVID-19 also had a large effect on their private lives and how they enter the police station when they start a shift. Of course, we also asked them about what COVID-19 did in general to policing and how they deal with the cases they have to deal with. We asked them about information use. We also asked them about ethical dilemmas they were confronted with, and more or less to our surprise, almost half of the police officers replied that they indeed experienced ethical dilemmas because of COVID-19. And and last but not least, we asked them for lessons they have learned and what we could do better in the future. When we carried out these interviews, we asked them what could be done better in the second wave, but we are in the third wave already. So, I think the lessons learned can be used in the future. On this slide, you will see some results that we saw in the police files. So traditional crime, as Rachel also mentioned, traditional crime like burglary and shoplifting dropped significantly. Also, we saw a drop in social problems, but that is not because we had less social problems, but because community support officers, they lost contact with the citizens and they were not able to report social problems. And that they also mentioned that they were no longer able to have contact with the citizens behind the front doors. We also had a drop in traffic issues, traffic accidents, etc. We saw a rise in cybercrime. And last but not least, we saw a tremendous rise in social environment issues like nuisance, public order, suspicious situations, and the like. And these were obviously because of the COVID and the risk of contamination. And next slide. And some impressions on the basis of the interviews. Police patrol work seems to shift from the concept of consent policing to enforcing social distancing, which is not what police officers like very much. This requires a more repressive style of policing, and it's not. One of the police officers said, "This is not why I wanted to be police. I wanted to be a police officer to help people, to fight crime, and not to enforce this social distancing." And we also saw this in the police records because we do have a code for a gathering, the gathering of people flocking together. Which was never used before, but is used now for the first time. The same goes for police warning. Also, this code was never used, which does not say that there was never a police warning in police practice, but the code was never used, so they never recorded that they warned someone officially. And this is done more often now. And what police officers mention quite often is that where other people or hesitate or freeze or stand aside, they have to make a step forwards and come into action. And this is the matter in cases of law enforcement as well as in cases of rendering help to those in need. And of course, this increases the risk of contamination, and especially in the first wave, there was a lack of equipment, and but this also meant that there was a higher risk of contamination because when it's really needed in the eyes of police officers, they come into action, they make an arrest, or they help someone who is in need. And later, then they realize, we live in a world with COVID-19. Probably, I have to test myself now because I've done something that probably I should not have done. Next slide. And when police officers were not really satisfied with how their work was done, they often felt that it was a matter of that the police officers should learn to organize their work in another way. And one of the clear examples in here was that two police officers told me that they entered a pub because there were too many people inside. They wanted to warn the owner, they wanted to send people outside. And later on, they realized that what they could have done was not entering the pub right away, but have a talk with the owner the next day, or just call the owner the next day, which is not how the police used to work in the early days. But in this situation, you might think about your working procedures and try to find other ways to do the things in the right way without the risk of contamination. And as I mentioned before, the officers recognized quite often ethical dilemmas, such as not being able to give priority to an arrest. I know Rachel mentioned this also earlier. Not being able to help someone properly, although they said if I need to give the kiss of life to someone, especially if it's a child, I will do so. Without, and it has to do with the things I mentioned before. Then they make this step forward, and then they go to action, and they don't care too much about their own health, which is something that we should take into account. Use of force against youth is also a problem, because of course often youth, they come together and hang around, and police officers these days have to warn them and say that they should not gather, and it doesn't. It's a problem for them. It doesn't really feel right that youth that do nothing wrong, actually, the only thing that they do wrong is that they come together and have fun, and they should use force against them. So it's a dilemma for them. And what also is a dilemma, that they often have to explain why airplanes can be fully booked, and people in their precinct, they have to keep the distance. So also this is for them an ethical dilemma, because I have to act and warn people, and on the other side, even some people from the national government, they don't respect the COVID-19 rules. Yeah, last slide. So we are still in the process of analyzing the data and writing a report. So I will be very happy to share more results at a later moment. And my contact details are on this slide. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Wouter. That's very useful and interesting to hear from a research project as well as from direct experience. We're going to turn now to Stephen and Emma from Thames Valley Police in the UK. And then I'll ask Phil Davis to add some further comments from Greater Manchester, because he's very helpfully stepped in while we were uncertain about Stephen and Emma. So a dose from the UK now, starting either with Stephen or Emma.
Okay, thank you, Jean. You read my mind. I was going to suggest that we had Phil as well to give a different force perspective in the UK. So I will keep my comments brief. Phil, just to give you a few minutes preparation, I mean, basically I'd said to Emma, I will cover a few points around the organisational aspects of COVID-19, and then she, as the COVID-19 silver for much of the pandemic, will talk about the operational stuff. So that might just give you a few moments just to frame your thoughts, but thanks for joining us, much appreciated. So, well, I must first of all be honest and say that I didn't have any what I would call hands-on experience with COVID-19. I'm the chief officer of a support department, and my role was quite simply to support. However, I do own some key assets in that area, things like health and safety, things like welfare, and things like occupational health, and clearly they were vital as we came up to speed. We quickly established a permanent goal and silver and bronze, which I think colleagues will be aware of what we're talking about here. And the governance was very much into the chief officer team on a daily and then weekly basis. Remote working became the norm for a lot of support staff, and we were constantly updating the advice around health, changing buildings, doing risk assessments, etc. Technology played a key part, and we have advanced so far with technology in this period, so that is one of the pluses, if that's the right word, of the pandemic. And most of our business these days is conducted on Teams, certainly has been during all the lockdown periods. Just to finish, so those are the key points. I mean, just to finish, we recently had, only this week, the HMIC FRS report published on policing, the first part of the pandemic, and there's a separate report on custody services. In general, the report praises police forces' dedication and commitment, responding to difficult circumstances, adaptability, assessing risk and planning, and communication and change. The custody report has a few recommendations about tracking the numbers of detainees, because obviously that didn't stop during the pandemic, and to record and monitor the length of time detained, record and monitor have they received their legal rights, and record the use of bail and release under investigation. So I think I'll probably stop there and leave my two operational colleagues to give you a much better sense of what it was like to deal with the pandemic as an operational police officer. So Emma, could I ask you first?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on a very old computer. Can someone check that you can actually hear me? Give me a thumbs
Yeah,
up.
it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And see,
As Stephen said, I'm Emma Bailey. I was the tactical commander at silver level for the COVID response in Thames Valley Police. And actually, if you go back just over a year when I first got asked to do this, I was asked to do this because I was a CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear commander. Now that seems a little bit over the top, but if you look at the context we were in back in February, we were watching everything go on overseas. We were watching Europe lock down. We were watching footage of France and Italy police officers using drones to enforce lockdown. Yet we were still in a place where obviously lots of people were coming into the UK, lots of events were being held. And the only involvement I had at that stage, or the reason I was brought in, was because we had people from British citizens from Wuhan being repatriated into Brize Norton, which was ours, and then to self-isolation centres, either in the Wirral or indeed Milton Keynes, which again we covered. So we were looking at the Coronavirus Act, we were looking at lots of PPE, we were treating it as a CBRN response. It very, very quickly changed when the PM stood on the podium, and things rapidly changed from an operational perspective as well as organisational. We took in the UK the approach which we call engage, explain, encourage and enforce. So absolutely rely on public confidence. We're policing by consent and take this incredibly seriously. So very concerned. When dealing with any of the COVID breaches around the regulations, we had to be aware that and try and get across to our officers that each individual incident might seem very low risk, which is people mixing as a crowd in a park or anything else like that. But actually, if we don't respond overall as in bulk, then actually there's a considerable risk, and lockdown would continue and everything else that goes with it. So the enforce was very much the last resort, which could involve taking somebody home, it can involve giving someone a fixed penalty notice or reporting them, or indeed arrest. The engage and explain aspects of it wasn't just about the police officers engaging and explaining. We were doing a huge amount on corporate communications, lots of joined up working. As part of my role, I was also doing the tactical coordination, chairing the tactical coordination group for all the other agencies. So as a consequence of that, our partnership work was extremely joined up. So we had, I think there's about 10, well, still do, but there's about 10 working groups working to the tactical coordination group, of which the police were involved in pretty much all of them. So if I just give an example, the one on children's education and further education, we had people from domestic and child abuse involved, just so we could capture those issues around children who might be vulnerable. So vulnerable children were offered school places, as were indeed key workers' children. However, a lot of them weren't turning up at school. So we wanted to get sight of that to understand where potentially these vulnerabilities lay. Indeed, the same applies with domestic abuse. We are very concerned around domestic abuse increasing and not necessarily being reported. So one of the opportunities we used there is that we joined up part of our multi-agency working out. We did some joint visits in the first wave to some of our high-risk domestic victims. Didn't wait for a report. We knocked on the door and we made sure, obviously COVID compliant, made sure that they were safe and gathered information. One of the key challenges for us was the speed of change. I think would apply to absolutely everybody. Some of our regulations were announced, or the change in the rules, shall we say, was announced by the Prime Minister on the podium. But then at that point, the regulations didn't exist, and the guidance might have existed about 30 minutes later, but it didn't necessarily represent what would exist in the regulations the next day. And police officers were expected to have to enforce the regulations when the regulations didn't even necessarily exist for a day or two, or potentially or so on and so forth. So the speed at which we had to understand what was being asked of policing, turn that into realistic operational guidance that every cop could understand, was a huge challenge. And I think it's fair to say that it was definitely not the norm, but media did feature some high profile cases where some forces' approach to enforcement were at odds with the national thinking and with public mood. So there was one force that indeed did use drones in light of our European colleagues. Personally, at PVP, we felt that was a little bit too George Orwell for us, so we stepped away from that. We didn't think there was a public support behind that, unless, of course, we had significant raves or something that was at the one end of the spectrum. We had media issues where we saw police officers in certain parts of the country allegedly checking people's shopping trolleys in supermarkets to make sure that they had essential items. But again, these really weren't the norm. Thames Valley, our main faux pas was in the beginning of the second wave, as we shut down a church service when perhaps we shouldn't have done. I have to say, as a Silver Commander, in the first wave, I knew the regulations inside out, back to front, and you would probably want to hear that. In the second wave, I really, really struggled. It just kept changing so much. There was too much to do. So I had to form a team that were essentially a team of people who were tactical advisors that did the operational guidance, who at any one time knew exactly what they were doing, and our legal team obviously as well. So if I can't, as a Silver Commander, keep on top of the nuances of the regulation changes probably every 2 to 3 weeks or less, then how on earth can we expect our PCs to do the same? So for me, that was the main challenge, the confusion and the complexity. How do we get around that was, especially in relation to big events and those ones around that critical community confidence, church services, sporting events, the things that really matter to our communities. What we did is we told officers in the second wave, in order to avoid any difficulties, is we set a tactical parameter where if you're to attend an event that looked, for all intents and purposes, like it probably shouldn't be on, so not a rave, not a really obvious blatant breach, but something that was perhaps organised and perhaps may have stepped over the line, don't stop the event, take the evidence, engage, explain, speak to everybody, work out what it is you've got. Let the event continue, because let's be realistic, the event's already on. If there's COVID being spread, then COVID already has been spread. Come away, seek that advice, and then to seek to prosecute retrospectively if needs be. But that was the second wave approach, very much from the learning of the first approach. Everything on the first wave was very much almost found committing, which is a term that I tend to use. Opportunities, I'll be brief on this one, so I'm conscious of time. Opportunities, I talked about the partnership working. I think partnership working, I think it will continue in the vein it's in. I don't think we'll be having TCGs and SCGs, coordination groups every week, but I certainly think that our links are built and they will last for the foreseeable. The other thing, one that made us smile a little bit, was around the organised crime. We had to make business continuity measures in order to manage COVID. Other businesses had to, so did our criminals. So we recognised that OCGs, organised criminals, had to actually adapt their ways of working. We got behind that with intelligence. We recognised that a good portion of them were at home, very conveniently, because they were being told to, and we organised operations to make sure that we took advantage of that. Also taking advantage of the reduced demand on policing in that first wave, where burglary went down, where the normal traditional volume crime was not being reported. We took that opportunity in the first wave to use that demand reduction to actually focus on our organised crime. Second wave, unfortunately, not at all the case. COVID demand is there, normal demand is there, and it has been a bit more of a struggle. So that kind of summarises it. So any questions?
Great, thank you very much, Stephen and Emma. And we'll hear from an operational commander in a different area of the UK with Phil.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, nothing like a bit of pressure to get a few points written down on a piece of paper. I always find it fascinating to listen to police colleagues from other areas of the world, because you hear so many similarities of experience, and it just reminds me, and it reminds everyone, I think, that policing is a human experience. So regardless of where you are in the world, you know, the same kind of things crop up. It's absolutely fascinating. For myself, I'm a chief superintendent in Greater Manchester Police, which the city area, police is a city area of about 2 million people, with about 200 languages spoken that we know of. And we have about 11,000 staff working to keep the people of Greater Manchester safe. For the majority of 2020, I was the COVID recovery lead for the force, primarily focusing on long-term recovery strategy, but obviously I got involved in the operational stuff as well. Right from the outset, I think, when we realised that this was a critical scenario, we had a strategy of splitting recovery and response into two streams. So we started thinking from the very first weeks in sort of late March, early April of 2020, what's our long-term recovery strategy going to be? How are we going to get back to normal? But also, what can we learn from? What are the risks, but also what are the opportunities that are part of that? Now, in relation to the response, I mean, this will be familiar to UK officers in the room, but I'm not sure about other countries. We went to a standard gold, silver, bronze response for a critical incident management, command and control right the way through, and we just, you know, the balloon went up as it were, and we got on with it. Now, Greater Manchester Police, it has always been very good at that kind of thing, you know, be it a terrorist attack or be it a flood, be it large-scale protest at a Labour or Conservative Party conference, riots, what have you. When the balloon goes up, there's just this mentality in my force where everyone switches on. They know what they need to do, and they run around and they do it, and they put energy into it. The other side, the recovery side, the strategy side, I found it much more difficult to get the energy behind it. And that's my reflections from the time. We got there in the end, but everyone was so interested with the tactical response, the GSB, and getting everything ready that you struggled for airtime initially with the long-term recovery strategy. So that's a reflection I think I took away from the time. I'll not repeat what's been said from my friends in Thames Valley Police, but we did have all of the headaches of enforcement, particularly the style of policing, which we did fluctuate depending on which silver commander was in the chair on the day, what Boris had said the night before, and getting that out to the frontline cops and getting consistency from their responses. So we weren't breaking up, you know, in large public ways 10-year-olds birthday parties, but we were addressing, you know, raves and where people were being a bit daft with their time in relation to breaching the COVID rules. And one of the innovations that came out of that time was the ability to adapt to technology. So communicating to our frontline officers was absolutely vital during that time, and we didn't have a way of doing it. We had something on the shelf for about 18 months, which was a secure mass broadcast a system through, you know, through our mobile devices, which everyone in the force has now got their own personal Samsung S9. It's about pushing key messages out to everybody from what was happening the night before, and we'd had this thing on the shelf. I'm speaking from personal experience because I'm a digital lead for the force. So we had this thing on the shelf for 18 months, which we thought was really important. It came out of the Arena attack as a recommendation. and we'd not managed to get the business case sorted. It had gone round and round our governance loops. Within 3 weeks of the lockdown, I had my kit. It had gone through governance. We'd spent the money, and our providers very quickly turned around what we needed, and suddenly we had a tool. That then set precedent for us to do other things. It was a case of, look, we can do this stuff when we put our minds to it, and we can get through all the governance hoops, and we can still keep everything boxed off and tight in relation to what we need to do with that for scrutiny purposes. What else can we do? So then there was suddenly a rapid explosion of other kinds of things that could help us, particularly in and around teams and distribution of agile kit. The entire workforce, and I'm sure this was the same for Thames Valley, the entire workforce had to go agile overnight. And we had to completely change our IT estate in the course of a few weeks, from a desktop-based to a laptop-based environment. Fortunately, we had the relationships with the right suppliers that we were able to do that fairly quickly. But that has suddenly created an environment that we're never going to go back from. So I'm now sat in my office at home. I don't need to be at headquarters this morning, so I'm not. I'm here, and that goes for all of the 300 staff who work for me. If they don't need to be in, they're not going to be in. So that creates a whole long-term strategy about what are we going to do about our estate, how are we going to keep visible as an organisation, and that then fed into the recovery side of it. So whilst all this other stuff was going on with the GSB side, we had all the protests, we had to manage, we had some real issues with some of our communities in relation to Black and ethnic minority citizens and the infection rates being higher. The right wing, we have a right wing issue in Greater Manchester Police. They took advantage of that in terms of their own protests and propaganda. We had to manage all of that. We had to manage our own staff well-being and ensure we got the PPE and the communications and managed working safely. And then we had all of the crime aspect that's already been covered by Thames Valley, particularly in around vulnerability, because vulnerability went right up, serious acquisitive crime went right down, our policing model changed overnight, and we had people in serious acquisitive crime that we needed in vulnerability, and we had to have all that kind of movement across. The long-term recovery really need to think about understanding the interconnectivity of all of our functions. So when you go to a critical scenario, you are in civil contingencies mode, which every force has to be in. We're a first line responder. We have to have a civil contingencies plan that allows us to deliver on core services as a first line responder. But those plans are only ever written for a short term hit. The plan that we blew the dust off the plan that was written after SARS around pandemics, and it didn't last 48 hours because it was written for what would be a short-term thing. We're now into our second year of this. Contingency planning needs to move to a much more dynamic understanding of how your organisation can work, survive and recover. And that was something completely new that we had to look at. So we had to start mapping out all of the interdependencies and of all of our functions as a force, identifying their strengths and weaknesses, identifying their road to recovery and how that would impact all the other areas of policing in GMP, and then trying to coordinate that, because one function's pace of recovery could impact another function's pace of recovery. And that's where you've got this multi-dimensional system going on that you've got to keep track of. And that was part of my role, was to try and understand, map all of that out. And we created an analogy for our force leadership team to help them. So each one of their functions was an aeroplane in the sky. And the recovery plan for COVID was the air traffic control. Each one of those planes had different passengers, had different levels of fuel, they'd come from different destinations, they had different landing times. And we needed to make decisions on every function in the force. Do they go back and land from where they came? Do they circle above air traffic control until there is a landing pattern that allows them to land? Do we divert them somewhere else? And that was the analogy we used for every function within the force to try and get us into a coordinated framework for recovery. And that as an analogy clicked with people, and it allowed us to get some work done to get us back on track. We're still not there in terms of a lot of our major pieces of work in terms of our transformational change have been put back a year. that hasn't helped us in terms of how we perform as a force, and we are currently as a force being inspected quite heavily from our national governance bodies, our inspectorate, in relation to how we recover our performance. But what we did do is I think successfully manage all of the emergency stuff, but also create this pathway for the long-term recovery, but also the opportunities as well. And I'm sure we want 10 minutes for questions, Jean, so I think I'll stop there, because I was a shoo-in.
Well, as a shoo-in, you've done a brilliant job, so thank you. And I think some really interesting ideas there. And I like the aeroplane air traffic control metaphor there. We do only have 10 minutes, but we did start a bit late. So I'd propose that if people feel they've got to leave at 9:30, they should leave and not worry. But otherwise, if people would like to stay on for an extra, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, it feels to me we've had some very, very rich insights and very varied insights as well from the different contexts. And it'd be really good to explore that a bit if people were happy to stay on. I'm going to hand over to Eduardo to, if you like, orchestrate questions, observations, whether they're from the floor or speakers between each other. So, Eduardo.
Thank you, Jean, and my apologies, of course, to everyone. I'm so sorry I had this terrible glitch with my user not being recognized. So, apologies particularly to Rachel, because I could only join whilst you were already speaking. It's been absolutely great. I think we've all been learning a lot. I would really very much open the floor, as Jean said, to both all participants, of course, who have kind of kept their questions ready. If you wanted to either raise your hand or write it down in the chat. And of course, also panelists, you can ask questions to each other. Whilst you warm up, I just say this, not two things, it's actually two hints, but it's fantastic that we are now here, learning from, especially from the response to the first wave. As always, in learning in the social sciences, we have these two challenges. One is how to, what is it that we are learning that can be used in the future? Because every time the challenge presents itself with some new traits. And second, context. And this is, I think, the incredible richness of this panel, that we have all these experiences and learning processes rooted in different and diverse contexts, also temporal contexts, with the key shaping events, formative events of each police force, which played a role in the first response. And now we are trying to learn and adapt, not just to cope with the continuation of COVID, but of course to any similar challenge that may show up in the near future. Let's hope not, but we must be ready. So, questions, reflections, also considerations, panelists as well. It's been fantastic. Personally, I've taken so many notes and learned so much. Yeah. I'm browsing both. I can't see raised hands nor anything. I also have a little bit of a reserved question, but I didn't want to.
Walter had his hand up.
Yeah, I raised my hand, but I just started talking. I had a question to probably all of you, but what I noticed is that some police officers were more anxious about the virus than others, and some police officers prefer to do a patrol on their own, solo patrol, or patrolling by motorcycle, because it's another type of solo patrol. This also asks for organizing the patrol function in a different way, or at least to have an eye on the different wishes and the different situations the police officers are in, because some are in a vulnerable situation, some have vulnerable people at home or in the families. How do you deal with this in your situations in other countries? and probably this is especially a question to Rachel from the US and to Phil.
That's a really great question, and definitely factored in. I think being a smaller agency, we implemented, like I said, practices and policies to minimize the impact. I think Ian also mentioned, having different waves of people, scheduling. We have a unique situation being in different buildings, and so we didn't cross-contaminate between buildings. Dispatch, same thing. Officers were not allowed into dispatch. And there were definitely people who lived like with older parents or family members that had health issues, that they still needed to come to work and do what they needed to do. But definitely, I think, separated themselves as much as they could, from other cross-contamination within the department. It's been very interesting to see the different opinions and feelings of different officers, about how they dealt with it. One of the things that was interesting, and when I was actually listening to your presentation talking about the research, we had started a health and wellness project. We had been written into a grant. So actually a couple years or a year or so before COVID started, but for various reasons it was held up. And so we ended up doing the first phase of it, which was a survey, and we're just now getting the data back, but I'm very interested to actually see how much stress was actually due to COVID, because when we initially started, we didn't have the pandemic going, we didn't have the protests going, and looking at how that impacted our officers and all of our staff. And now based on that data, we'll look at ways to mitigate that moving forward. So that's one of the ways that we're looking at it, but just being mindful and trying to work with our staff as best we can. And I also think what Phil said, having the option that if they are able to work remote, most officers are unable to do that. We have to be out in the field. But if they have a position or the opportunity or some factor that we can allow them to do that, allowing that, and facilitating that is important too.
Yeah, I'll quickly respond with a couple of points as well. So particularly going back to the frontline roles, there were some significant impacts and also significant thinking that went into managing the contingencies of that. So, and this was all based on the guidance that was coming out centrally from the National Police Chiefs Council around working safely. So if you take patrol, for example, there was the presumption that patrol would have to be solo because we didn't want more than one officer in a single vehicle, which meant we needed more vehicles on the road, which then put a massive demand on our workshops. So we generally run with 10 to 15% of our, I'm sure Steve could talk about this, but we run with about 10 to 15% of our vehicles at any one time in a workshop getting repaired from a bang or getting its service or whatever. We needed to really reduce those numbers. So we had to increase how our vehicle workshops were running. But the vehicle workshops also had to work safely and working at distance. So that created quite a few logistical headaches for our department in relation to that. But then you had the added implications of police officers solo in what can be quite risky areas of the city, and managing the expectations of officer safety, particularly with our staff associations who were very vocal in our force, and also making sure that we were complying with health and safety legislation and what we were asking officers to do. So that required a whole new culture of dispatch in relation to what you send a solo officer to. Following that, you had the custody suite scenario, which was an absolute bottleneck for COVID spreading. And it was how you managed working safely in a closed environment full of prisoners who are kicking off and who are not particularly pleased to be locked up. And the whole arrest strategy had to change in terms of who you brought into custody. The whole process of booking a prisoner in and keeping people safe had to be undertaken, and a whole post-arrest, prisoner allocation procedure in terms of making sure everything kept clean. So we had to increase specialist cleaning, and the specialist cleaners that went in there had to have safety training to ensure that they could work in an environment that might become violent. So we had to pay them more. So we had to find money for that. And it's all that kind of thing. But the one final thing I would say is firearms. So we have, although we're an unarmed, technically, police service in the UK, we do have armed patrol, particularly in some areas of Manchester. And we had to manage how that happened because you can't patrol alone. The firearms officers can't patrol alone. So we had to look at arrangements for firearms officers sleeping in hotels and all that kind of thing, being away from their families. Really, really stressful time for these officers. And then you're asking them to carry a gun. So we had a whole thing we had to wrap around that as well. So absolutely, this all came from the perspective of what it's like for the frontline officer, because we had focus groups with those officers themselves when we were coming up with these plans.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the panelists, maybe Ian or Stephen, have something to add to Wouter's question or point. Otherwise, I will ask Nikki to get...
Stephen, Eduardo, Stephen.
Yeah, please.
The one point that perhaps I would emphasise, which we haven't so much covered between Phil and Emma and myself, is the whole switch of emphasis in learning and training. And moving from, we have very big requirements in policing for operational training, currency, and what have you. And as Phil's indicated, many of our approaches were face-to-face, and some of them have to be. But we shouldn't underestimate the amount of training that we have shifted online, the amount of training we have had to do in a risk-assessed environment to keep our people current, particularly in some of the most operational areas. I just mentioned the training learning field because I don't think, unless I missed it at the very earliest when I wasn't online, that's a really important point. I mean, for instance, at one point we did stop our initial police officer training, but tried to get that back online, and that's really where we've got to. And I agree with Phil's sentiment that I don't think we'll return to many of the old ways in respect of this area.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know if Ian wants to add something. We have anyway 2 questions, which I would give in sequence. So first Nikki and then Richard, and then back to the panelists for another probably final round of considerations, and then of course back to Jean for closing the session. So maybe
it's probably
yes. Thank you.
Probably similar to what's already been said around, it's essentially a pragmatic person by person approach that individuals' circumstances vary enormously. I think like Phil said, we had I was going to think of one example where we had somebody who chose to stay in hotels away from her family, away from her children, to make sure that they were kept safe so that she could carry on doing her role. And also we had people who had vulnerable relatives at home, and so but were actually part of our frontline response groups, but we were able to rotate them into roles that kept them that allowed them to work from home. So found other roles for them and then backfilled them on the front line. So it was very much a person by person approach, and as has also been said around, you've got to have that health and safety focus and wellness focus for your people, because at the end of the day they're going to be critical to keeping the wheels on and keeping it moving forward. So yeah.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Nikki and then Richard in a sequence, and then back to each panelist. To spare on time, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank each panelist and each participant so much. It was absolutely great, and then I will directly give the floor also back to Jean for closing the session. A really fantastic panel, and special thanks to our panelists. Now Nikki, and then Richard, and then back to the panelists and Jean to close. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but based on some of the research that we're doing with a couple of UK forces, which which haven't been covered here, is we've talked about the well-being of the kind of frontline staff and etc. But the strategic command approach tends to assume a very time-limited context for dealing with critical and major incidents, such as COVID. And I was just interested in the practices of maybe some of the other countries in dealing with senior command fatigue, where there's such a crisis of extended duration. Anyone?
Maybe, Richard, you want to also formulate your question, and then each panelist can tackle both questions, and also to give a little bit to each panelist to take note. Richard?
Thank you, Eduardo. I was struck by the fact that COVID was not only constituted as a public health crisis, but also was highly politicized in some quarters. And that, of course, is quite a different public management policing dynamic, and which has implications for both the style and effect of policing, but also the wider public management space. And I was just interested in what the panelists' experiences and thoughts on that kind of duality of the experience, which might not be present in other spaces to the extent that we saw in the COVID crisis.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I would give the floor first to Rachel, also because it's very late for you, and then the panelists, maybe in the order in which you have presented, so you can kind of prepare your intervention. Thank you again, everyone, so much.
Certainly. First, thank you all for having me. This has been really a fascinating experience. And I echo, I think Phil was saying how similar our experiences are. But in thinking of these two questions, you know, in terms of dealing, so the first question was from Nikki in terms of dealing with management fatigue, right? And how do we do that? For us, our command staff is, there's 5 of us. Well, actually, I take that back. There's six of us. And really, I think that the opportunity to utilize technology to be able to work from home when we need to and have the flexibility, definitely utilizing that option, I think has been good. I think that we all have, you know, clearly in the early phases and the first wave, you know, everyone, it was all hands on deck. Same when the protests started, but as we got going, you know, we learned to, you know, have a certain amount of staff in the office, you know, and actually present for our troops, while the others are able to step back and maybe be able to work from home, and also making time, you know, making sure that people are allowed to have some time off as we're going to be able to recuperate and take care. I don't know if that answers your question. What you're looking at, there was nothing formalized, just that as we have the breaks in the different phases that have come through, we've been able to kind of regroup, take a breath, you know, to move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Richard, I think I kind of alluded to it when I was talking about, you know, the protests of the mask, the anti-mask. It really, you know, I've had so many thoughts as I'm listening to everyone else speak, because you know, from the very beginning, there was, I think, a lot of misinformation, you know, distributed, and clearly very, very polarized thoughts and beliefs on it. And I think at the end of the day, truly working with our communities and you know, locally, we've just had a lot of success at, you know, although we don't have or I don't think utilized the 4 E's and listed it out that way. We were obviously following that same protocol. And, you know, I think everyone has their own personal, you know, opinions or thoughts on all of this. But at the end of the day, I think that we understand that we all have a common goal, which is keeping our communities safe, both from crime as well as from COVID-19, and taking care of each other. And I think that that's really how having that common goal allows you not to get caught up in the political side of things. So.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Ian, maybe you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think we learned a lot from, if I don't know, people overseas can remember the Pike River mining disaster that we had here, where about quite a number of miners got trapped underground, and we essentially had one silver commander throughout that, and it had a significant impact on his wellness. So then, by the time the Christchurch earthquake came along, which was about a year later, a lot of improvements had been made, and we were acutely aware of the need to rotate people through those silver command spaces because to avoid that risk of burnout, and also to keep some of our executive members in the background as well in case of the need to for escalation and to come in and to provide support. So a lot of that was that learning organisationally we'd already gone through it kind of the hard way. But I think the other thing which is what then comes into Richard's question is we've been pretty clear that this is a health response, and and that's been a good thing and a bad thing. It was interesting hearing colleagues from the UK talking where it seems that that sort of, I think police were a lot more familiar with responding in a particular way around a crisis and stepping up, because we certainly had some very bizarre conversations where we were talking past our public health colleagues where we were saying, what do you want us to do? We're here. And they couldn't articulate it. They knew that they wanted us to do something, but they couldn't articulate what it was. And that's a lot better now, but it caused a lot of frustration at the time. But I think as well, we've been very lucky with the politicization that we haven't seen that anywhere near to the extent that has been seen overseas, and having sort of pushing public health to the fore and being clear that we're following the science and following scientific advice, I think has possibly helped with that. But yeah, at a national level, we've also seen dedicated roles created to pull those multi-agency teams together. So our previous commissioner retired just about beginning of May 2020 and was he left on the Friday wearing a uniform. He was back on the Monday wearing a suit, working in a multi-agency centre commanding the COVID response. Whilst his successor pulled the uniform on and commanded the police response. So we've been kind of like, and so that sort of allowed again, that the impact on individuals to be managed. Because I think similar things have happened with other agencies and with dedicated short or fixed term roles have been created to help. Yeah.
Thanks very much. So insightful. Then Wouter, and then just for you to get ready, Stephen, Emma, and Phil. Wouter, please.
And Emma.
And Emma. I have one question to all the others actually, and that is the role of the dispatch room was mentioned earlier. I think it was by Phil, and I was wondering, should the command and control room not have a more extensive role and a more important role in police patrol work? Because what they can do is guide police patrol officers to work in a more safer way than they would do if they follow their basic instinct, which is come into action and do something. So I was wondering, should we rethink the role of the dispatcher?
I can answer that one if that helps from UK.
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah. So we, from a command and control point of view, from a command centre, so for us, we call it the call centre, so our control room managing it. So I was obviously tactical commander for the whole of Thames Valley Police, but I had somebody calling in from a bronze perspective from the control room who was actually quite a senior manager. So we definitely altered the triage process for how we managed crime and had to provide guidance in relation to what we wanted people to go to, what we wanted to be managed online. We brought in online reporting. That is now going to be a legacy that will continue for other aspects. With that, we front-loaded information to the public to try and stop getting bulk low-end incidents coming in. And then we also provided, had a resourcing response where we had a dedicated car just to respond to COVID matters. That didn't mean that no one else responded to COVID matters. It just meant at any one time, we knew we had a car in each of our local areas that could respond. We also identified the priority of that we wanted neighbourhood resources, so community response, to attend these in the first instance. We made good use of our police community support officers. In fact, our police community support officers came into their own because of COVID. And I have no doubt that that might have influenced some strategic decisions later on the line in relation to funding that have been made later this year. So yes, we did influence both our call handling, but also our responding in relation to how we manage COVID alongside other demand. It was a challenge. I think one of the main challenges that we've noticed in the last few months has been around responding to the border inquiries. So where people have come into the country from certain areas and are meant to be self-isolating for 14 days, we are meant to go out and check and support the border agency with that. We found that demand has been very, very difficult, and we've had to look at how we manage that. So yes, we have changed it, but everything in line with trying to change the business as usual, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, just tweaking our current triage processes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Emma. Maybe Wouter, you want to conclude also on the two general questions, or you're fine?
Yeah, in my earlier days, I worked at Command and Control Center in Amsterdam, and I learned how important it is for police officers on the streets when they go to a very complicated call or a very stressing situation. It's very important that there is a dispatcher who keeps stays calm and keeps control over the situation and guides the police officers what to do or what not to do. And it struck me that police officers that I spoke to about COVID-19 is that they sometimes said, yeah, we were sent to a situation and the Command and Control Center could have guided us better. Because once we are at the scene, we have to act. There's no way to guide us anymore, almost no way, because we have to act, we have to do something. People are waiting for us to act. For instance, in a situation that somebody got a heart attack. We can't, then we can no longer wait and tell the people that stand there that we first have to go back to our car and put on our safety suit. So what Command and Control could do is say to us, put on your safety suit and then I will tell you where you have to go. Instead of sending us to a place and there's no in fact, we feel that there's no time left to take precautional measures. So this brought me to the idea that it might be very important to also rethink about the role of our dispatchers.
If I can just really quickly respond to that, Walter, our dispatch center did make those changes, and we did end up sharing that information so that we could address that and make sure that our folks were safe responding. It's a very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wouter. Thank you, Rachel. May I give the floor to Stephen now for a final consideration also on the questions from.
Thank you, Edward. Just a couple of points from me. First of all, trying to hint back at Nikki's question about command fatigue. I think what we have discovered is that there is a tension between consistency of leadership and command fatigue. Because, as I said, and as Emma expanded upon, we went for the consistency of leadership, and actually, because of how complex it was and how the rules were changing virtually daily following political announcements, I think to chop and change would have been quite difficult. So that's where people that are in my directorate come into their own. We had an established welfare bronze. We used occupational health extensively. But sometimes it is difficult because police officers in particular, and many police staff, by nature, will work harder and harder and harder when they see the mission is greater and greater. So that will be my first point. Just responding slightly to Richard's point, public health or politicised, Richard, I didn't see it so much as, not so much politicised as political centre stage. And literally when you were watching Boris or whoever was speaking in their evening briefings, it was clearly established that way. Yes, there have been criticisms, but generally speaking, the other parties have been supportive because it's a national issue. And I think my final just comments really, I think we have got where we've got to by adopting a balanced all-force approach. And we shouldn't underestimate the enabling teams in supporting those operational officers. And picking up Phil's point, I think going forward, this is learn and adapt. And like Phil, I don't see us returning to many of the ways that we might previously have practiced. That's me, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Emma, maybe you have your considerations on Nikki's and Richard's questions, or anything you want, also anything you want to add?
No, nothing to add in relation to that, sorry.
Thank you so much, Emma. It was fantastic. I'm not sure I can see Phil. Phil, are you still connected?
Phil has had to leave, I'm afraid.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I was just. So I think the floor is yours, Jean, for concluding this wonderful session. It's been, for me, just a huge apologies again. Thank you. It's been fantastic.
Okay, great. Well, we're well over time, but I think pretty much most people have stayed because it's been really fascinating. I just want to add on that last point about politicians. I'm involved in a research project interviewing senior police at the moment, and it's quite interesting that one of the themes is that they feel COVID has actually strengthened and helped strengthened their relationship with local politicians, MPs, local councillors, and that's actually helped in some ways. Bit of a mixed bag, but anyway. But my job now is just to, it's an important thing to do, is to close this session and to thank all our speakers and everybody who's contributed. So Rachel and Ian, who both stayed up really late, Wouter, Stephen and Emma, who worked very hard to get into the webinar, and also Phil for stepping in. Each of you have made contributions which have been fascinating, and there'd be a lot to follow up, and perhaps really we should have set up a day's seminar rather than trying to do all this in just over an hour and a half. But really fascinating to hear those differences in approach due to context, due to how bad the pandemic was, how it was conceptualized, and what the police response was for that. So really thank you for preparing and speaking, and also people speaking from the floor. I mentioned that we have made a recording of this, so we'll have a look at that. I gathered Richard's got to do a bit of technical wizardry in the background. We will then check it back with the speakers, first of all, that you're happy about it, but also be thinking perhaps about situations in which this might be useful to share more broadly, if you're happy with that. But thank you for staying on. It's been really rich, and I hope there'll be ways to continue this discussion as well. So thank you very much, and bye everybody.
Thank you very much.